Hello and welcome back to Global Careers. This week we're looking at confidence, and so this is part of the working well cycle of the course. No longer thinking about, trying to get our foot in the door and what would suit us, but once we've started in the world of work, whatever that might be, whether it's like an initial foot in the door or whether it's like further along the track, it is important to think about how it is that we can set ourselves up for a fulfilling work life. And part of that story is about feeling confident and competent in the workplace. And this is by no means an easy task, and it's something that, if you read a lot around, the area of, work and careers, confidence is a big issue, and so we'll be addressing some of those in the discussion today. And we'll be addressing not only confidence and ways to build it, but also looking at what is popularly referred to as, the imposter syndrome, and that comes a bit later, thanks to our friend of the course, Anna Branford, from the career section of RMIT. So what I'm going to do is begin by giving a couple of tips in terms of the presentation today is going to focus initially around like short-term, short boosters for confidence. But as the presentation goes on, it dwells longer on longer-term ways to address issues of confidence. And so one of the tips that you may have seen if you read around this area of confidence and the workplace and so on is, of course, in any given circumstance, you'll be feeling, either anxious or nervous because it's, whether it's a job interview or a presentation or a meeting where maybe there's going to be some, discussion that could be difficult or something like that. Those feelings of nervousness and anxiousness is perfectly natural. And one of the tips that has been suggested is and this comes from the book which I've referred to a couple of times in this course, which is How to Have a Good Day, which is a nice name for a book, is to reframe those feelings in a positive or more constructive way. And so you would maybe naturally feel those feelings as being sort of nervous and sort of like a negative experience, but you can reframe those experiences as being in terms of excitement. And so it's about feeling excited and in a positive and excited way, in the same way as maybe you would be excited in advance of a party that you're looking forward to. So similar actual physical feelings, but reframing them in a positive way. So this is one of the tips that's often been suggested for boosting confidence in the short term. Another one is to think about your language. And so in this course, one of the things we have focused on is language of two sorts, obviously your verbal language and your body language. And the language, of course, is important, as you would know, studying a degree such as yours, in terms of how you communicate and understanding, language as a form of communication, of which body language is one of those as well. However, one question I think is really worth asking and bearing in mind is the question of who is the audience of your language. And so the natural assumption is that the audience of your language is the person who you're interacting with or the people who you're interacting with. But actually there is another audience for your language, and that is yourself. And so there is a concept which I learned from Roy Rappaport's book, which is on the screen here, and that is the concept of self-referential messages. So the messages that you try to send yourself. So of course, we kind of understand that there's sort of a conscious self, and then there's sort of an unconscious self, and those are kind of, in some ways different because, in some ways, your unconscious self is whatever, feeling nervous or anxious or something, and your conscious self is trying to do things to calm yourself down. And so your conscious self, you can try to send your unconscious self messages in various ways. So one of the key ways that comes through is in body language. And you can think about how you send these signals to yourself. So bearing in mind that body language can be interpreted and mean different things in different countries, and that some people can interpret some body language as meaning one thing and another. The most common one is like the folding of arms as being sort of a closed signal, but there are actually loads of other explanations. But having said that, even though you might not believe that crossed arms is a closing, like standoffish signal, other people might interpret it that way. So there is this sort of little bit of a thing where you need to be aware that certain signals don't mean what people think they do, but you're still interacting with people who think they might mean that. So yeah, having borne that all in mind, you never know kind of what school of thought your audience is subscribing to on this front. So one of the things that you may have that gets recommended, for example, in the Squiggly Career book is striking certain poses. So the most, I'll just unmic for a second, but it is these sort of what I call power poses, and these are. Oh my God, mic is off. Like these hands on, feeling good, planted. So those are the power poses, right? And there is some, there is a little bit of controversy, but the function of the power pose is really around you sending a message to yourself that you're feeling centered and planted and confident and striking that pose, often hands on hips. But the other thing that they talk about in the Squiggly Career book is finding ways to occupy space, right? To kind of feel as if you're owning the space, and that can be how you sit and just how the way you present yourself. And so these things are ways for you to send messages to yourself about, yeah, I'm feeling confident. So these are all little things that you can do to kind of get some short-term confidence boost. But with respect to the issues of controversy, so the second most, as I understand it, the second most watched TED Talk is this one by Amy Cuddy about striking power poses, right? And one of the controversies around it is that it was based on some research that they did, and the psychological research studies that tried to replicate it, they couldn't do it. But I mean, just very briefly, one of the initial claims made by Amy Cuddy and her team was that striking these sort of power poses changes your blood chemistry to kind of be more like basically in line with what we would think as kind of confident and occupying a superior hierarchical position in society, those sorts of things. And the studies couldn't replicate that striking power poses resulted in changes of body chemistry. But actually, one of the things that is also true is that irrespective actually of the blood chemistry testing, people do report feeling more confident. And that's actually enough to kind of say, if it works for you, then you can do it. And psychological research has done this in any number of ways. So do I have a pen? Yeah. So there's like research that says, if you hold a pen in your teeth for a while, for 10 seconds, that uses the kind of the muscles that you use to smile, and then people after doing that, they report feeling kind of happier. That's one. And then there was another bit of psychological research, which I forget now. When I think about it, I'll record it and put it in audio here. Hi. So no, I just packed up, and then I remembered what it was. Hello, Pastor Julian, whichever side you're on. I remembered that other body language thing that I was trying to think of, which is what's called squinching. So I couldn't just do this by audio because it's a visual thing. So you'll see now in adverts often, especially like politicians, like they do this tiny little eye movement like this, and that makes people look determined. And so therefore, yeah, you could consider trying to squinch a bit more. All right, back to you. Okay, thanks, future Julian, for recording that and putting it in. So body language. You can use body language to kind of give yourself a confidence boost. The other changes to language that are recommended by Sarah Ellis and Helen Tupper are using a kind of more confident spoken language. So this is a change to your verbal language. And this is you're trying to remove things that make you seem as if you're communicating less confidently. So removing ums and things like, just and kinda and like, and trying to push people towards speaking in a more straightforward, clearer, unhesitating manner that conveys a sense of confidence, and people who hear people speaking confidently will presumably feel as if the person who is speaking confidently knows what they're talking about, and confer upon them a sense of, we think you're confident and you're competent as well. So they recommend changing the way the kinds of language that you use. And the other thing is they also recommend finishing your sentences. So they note that a lot of people don't realize that they don't finish their sentences, and they recommend obviously that you do finish your sentences. And as someone, so I mean, as with some of this stuff, you have to think about how it suits you, and there may be occasions where this is more important than others. So I think I would be saying that in certain circumstances, whether it's like presentations or interviews, you do want to practice coming across as like fully confident and planted, and trying to reduce those kinds of manners of speaking which may be seen to convey uncertainty and lack of confidence and so on. So I think there are circumstances where you might feel as if you want to do that. Some of this advice is really around longer term work practices and longer term ways of communicating. And the one that I often see is that people should apologize less, and this is often framed as you'll see in some of these in some of the articles around this as being a common form of rhetoric or discourse amongst women in particular. But I took notice because apologizing is inserting sorries and so on is like a big part of my discursive manner. And so I was paying attention to it, and they said, you shouldn't apologize so much because it makes you look, less confident and like inferior or whatever the case may be. And I was like, no. I mean, I agree to an extent, but I don't agree in the sense that I think some people are missing the point about what an apology is. So on the one hand, an apology is obviously an attempt to claim that, you acknowledge that you did the wrong thing and you apologize, and it's a admission of wrongdoing. But actually, I had always thought that the function of the apology or the sorry is to kind of reaffirm the relationship between you and another person, and like that accountability thing is sort of almost to the side in one respect. And the apologies are very common in some cultures more than others, and like the British are famous for apologizing. And I was at lunch with a British guy, and the waiter came across and said, "Oh, what's your order?" I said, "I'll have this," and the British guy was like, "Oh yeah, sorry, I'll have the." Yeah, he didn't even do anything wrong, and he started his sentence with a sorry, right? And so that's just part of the discursive thing. So, and I was like, oh, and for a long time I felt I was the only one who held this view, but then I listened to this podcast, and I'm just going to play you the relevant clip from it. It's about the differences between how men and women communicate, but obviously loads of men communicate in ways that are attributed to being, feminine ways of communicating, and I guess I would count myself, especially with respect to habits of using like apologies and hedging language and so on. Anyway, you'll see that the feminist communication researcher who's interviewed here lands with an opinion that kind of I felt corroborated mine. The point being is not that you should not try and iron some of this stuff out if you want to. The point being is that you should feel as if there is maybe space for the kinds of communication style that you have, and that some of these forms of advice in the world of work and careers and so on, you do take it with a grain of salt. You go with what feels works for you, and other stuff you should maybe try and feel a little bit confident in kind of saying, this is I don't necessarily agree with the recommendation to iron out all my apologies and so on and so forth. Anyway, let's listen to this neat clip.
But Deborah Cameron says beware of some of the advice out there.
The advice that you see in sort of business magazines or women's magazines about why you shouldn't apologise, why you shouldn't say just, which is a kind of what linguists call hedging, making something less forceful. The reasons given for that are really very, very simplistic. So, for example, anyone who's looked carefully at how apologies work in English is not going to draw the conclusion that they're always a way of taking blame upon yourself. They are often a way of showing consideration for the other person. You're not saying, I did something wrong. You're saying, I realise I might be imposing on you, and I want to display to you that I care about that. And it's a similar thing with just, can I just ask you a question? Doesn't mean, oh, I'm a humble little thing who has no right to ask anything. It means I'm intruding upon you, and so I'm going to kind of embed in the way I express that a signal that I know I'm imposing and that I want to persuade you to cooperate with me. So it's strategic.
So issues of confidence affect pretty much everyone, right? And obviously they're going to affect some people more than others. And one of the whole chapters that the Squiggly Careers book is dedicated to is the question of confidence and confidence building. And I'm going to just talk through a little bit of some more of their advice and narrate it a little bit. And so what are sometimes called limiting beliefs, they call confidence gremlins, which I think is a kind of a cuter way of referring to it. And they note that there are, different people have different kinds of confidence gremlins that they have to respond to. And so, for example, one confidence gremlin might be, I panic when I'm put on the spot. I don't feel confident disagreeing with other people. I lose confidence around a senior member of staff, or senior members of staff if they're in the same vicinity. I worry that I don't know enough, which is going to be probably something that affects a lot of people who are kind of just starting out. And another one is the fear of being found out, which can also be referred to as the imposter syndrome. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw to Dr. Anna Branford, again, as I said, a friend of the course, who's going to talk through how she understands and how she's enabling us to understand this concept of the imposter syndrome, both from like an individual's perspective, but she really enables us to understand it in a wider, social context as well. So thank you, Anna.
Hello, I'm Anna Branford over from Employability and Careers Education, and I'm here just to share a few thoughts with you about imposter syndrome, which can be a useful conceptual tool to have in your kit, perhaps for understanding something of your own experience, maybe for understanding other people a bit better. And I also want to suggest to you that it might be a concept worth thinking about a bit critically. So I'm going to take a few minutes here just to touch on some ideas in this area that I hope might be of some interest and of some use to you. So what's meant by the term imposter syndrome? The word imposter usually means someone who tries to deceive other people by pretending to be someone that they're not. And the idea of it being a syndrome suggests that this isn't the truth about that person, but more a kind of fear that they have and a kind of muddle in their own thinking. So we're talking here about a person's own fear that they might be an imposter and that they might be pretending to be someone that they're not. And usually that's in the context of their achievements, often in their studies and often in their careers. So, imposter syndrome is a pattern of self-doubt regarding the validity of a person's own achievements, expertise and competence, with a fear of being revealed as a fraud. So what might that look and feel like to experience? Well, let's say you're a couple of years into your studies now. You're passing most of your assessments, keeping up more or less with the readings, you're participating in tutorial discussions. So to everyone else, you look like a pretty strong student. But inside, you fear that you're really not a strong student. You've just somehow managed to fool other people into thinking that you are. So you fear that it's only a matter of time before people find you out and realize that actually you don't belong here at all. And that's the kind of feeling that the concept of imposter syndrome sets out to describe. And it's reported in workplaces too, where people can ascend surprisingly far along their career paths, still with this feeling that they have no real right to be where they are, and this fear that they will be found out and revealed to be a fraud or an imposter. So that might be a feeling or a cluster of thoughts that you recognize in yourself, seems to be experienced particularly strongly in university settings and along academic sorts of career paths for reasons I will speculate about in a moment. But even if you don't relate to it at all on that kind of personal level, it's a phenomenon that you might detect among peers and colleagues. You might hear it spoken about in the spirit of people labeling other people, or speaking in a kind of self-diagnostic way about their own thoughts and feelings. So wherever you're placed in relation to imposter syndrome, it can be a good concept to know something about, and also, I think, to think a little bit critically about. One of the first points that think pieces about imposter syndrome often point out is that people who experience it are in really excellent company. That is, a lot of high achievers in a really good range of fields describe having just these kinds of thoughts and feelings. And there is something interesting about it being, of all people, Tom Hanks, who said, "How did I get here? When are they going to discover that I am, in fact, a fraud and take everything away from me?" about it being Lady Gaga who said, "I still sometimes feel like a loser kid in high school," about it being Lupita Nyong'o who said, "I go through acute imposter syndrome with every role. I think winning an Oscar may in fact have made it worse." About it being Albert Einstein who said, "I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler." So it's a pretty interesting phenomenon to hear this pattern of thoughts and feelings expressed by very high achievers who, perhaps from where we're standing, couldn't possibly have faked their way to where they are, and yet seem to feel persistently and actually quite deeply that they did. So one potentially useful insight into what's happening is that while on one level it seems irrational and illogical for people like this, and perhaps like some of us, to carry this kind of self-doubt, it does actually have a rational logic to it that can be worth having a look at. So I mentioned before that universities and academia are places where imposter syndrome is very commonly described as experienced. And as a setting, I think it offers a good example for taking a good look at this kind of logic. So let's say that one of the reasons that you might be here now in the program you're studying is because of a documentary that you saw when you were 16 that had a really big impact on you. It introduced a topic in a way that really resonated with you. It showed a good handful of experts talking through different angles of the issue in a way that you fully understood, and you left that experience of watching with a whole new set of ideas that you felt excited about and passionate about, and able perhaps to debate pretty persuasively with other people about, especially if they hadn't seen the documentary that you saw. Then, a couple of years later, you decide to focus your studies at university around that same issue. And the further you go, the more you realise there is to know in this field. So maybe sometime late in first year, you have the horrifying experience of finding a reference in a reading to that documentary that you saw, talking about how badly it oversimplified some really key issues, how it completely excluded these really important factors, how it only considered the views of these sorts of people and left this other kind out altogether. Now, in fact, at this point, you know a lot more about your area than you did when you were 16, but it may well be that you felt considerably more certain of your expertise then than you do now. And that's because a big part of developing expertise is that with it, you also develop an increasing sense of how much there is out there that you don't yet know. And that creates a very interesting disconnect with the status that other people can start attributing to your progress in your studies and in your career. So you move, say, from first year to second year to third year, then you're a graduate, maybe you secure a role, maybe you take a postgraduate path. And with each of those steps, the world kind of recognizes an achievement and a statement of your growing expertise is perfectly possible and really not particularly irrational, that you actually feel less and less of an expert in your area, less deserving of that status. So that is, although you haven't set out to deceive anyone, it does make sense that you could feel like a fraud or like an imposter. So if this cluster of ideas and feelings is one that you relate to or one that you see in people around you, it can help to give it some of this kind of context and to understand that while it's a paradox on one level, it also has a kind of sense and a kind of logic to it. And back to the point about being in great company, this kind of context can help to explain why many people who are actually incredibly high achievers in their field describe feeling these sorts of things. So again, the more you know, the more you understand how much you don't know. So earlier on, I mentioned that it might be a good idea to take anything useful that you can find in a concept like imposter syndrome, but also to view it with a bit of a critical lens. And calling something a syndrome, that gives it a kind of diagnostic vibe, a pathologizing vibe. It establishes it as a problem, and in this case specifically a psychological kind of problem, and a thing that somebody has that's wrong with them. And if the concept helps you to identify that perhaps you're being really unnecessarily hard on yourself, that you're feeling terrible, and as though you've been somehow dishonest, when you really haven't done or said anything dishonest, then it could be a really great use of the concept just as it is. can help you to make sense of difficult thoughts that can be easier to unpack, and give you something to Google when it rears up, and know that you will find a large body of self-help and personal development materials that might be really helpful to you. And if you're actually at a point where worries about this kind of thing are holding you up or getting in your way, it can be great language to use when you're starting to talk about them with a counsellor or a psychologist and let them know about what's going on for you. But without taking anything away from that potentially very helpful aspect of the concept of imposter syndrome, it's also interesting to think about what happens if we try pushing back just a bit on the idea that it should be considered a sickness or a problem. Some measure of the cluster of thoughts and ideas that we've been considering is almost certainly actually a pretty good thing. It's very important to have a sense of what you don't yet know. And in a workplace, there really is an important place, say for employees, also for managers and for leaders who have a strong sense of what their expertise covers and also where their expertise ends, who can demonstrate that appropriate humility in their dealings with people, who consult with other people when making decisions because they know that they don't know everything. They've got a good idea of what they don't know, and they're perfectly at ease with reaching out to others when they know that they're approaching a gap. So although in a way it makes sense to call it a syndrome because it's such an unpleasant feeling and can cause people unnecessary worry and struggle, there might be a risk, so to speak, of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, making that really broad judgment about self-doubt might play into a system that tends to value qualities like confidence and decisiveness too far above those other qualities like humility and a willingness to seek feedback and to engage with complexity. And there's another really key point to make while we're thinking about the concept of imposter syndrome in this more critical way. Calling it a syndrome pretty firmly implies that what we're talking about is a problem that's in a person's head. It's an irrational, mistaken kind of thinking. We assume that it doesn't really match up with reality and it's something that needs to be sorted out within the head of the individual. And maybe that's exactly right, but maybe it can be a way of avoiding taking a good look at some of the systemic issues that can make some people feel like imposters, feel like they don't belong in places of study and in workplaces, no matter how much they achieve. Maybe it's not all in their heads. Maybe there is a workplace culture that is actually undermining of some people's confidence, that really does subtly or overtly keep bringing some people's basic competence into question. Now, in that situation, it may well be the places that need fixing, and certainly not the individuals who need to be told that their experience is a syndrome and that it's all in their mind. Here I'm quoting an article by Rachika Tulshan and Jodie Ann Bury, which I've linked in the PowerPoint, but I'll also send through a link for. It's called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. So they say, the impact of systemic racism, classism, xenophobia, and other biases was categorically absent when the concept of imposter syndrome was developed. Many groups were excluded from the study, namely women of colour and people of various income levels, genders and professional backgrounds. Even as we know it today, imposter syndrome puts the blame on individuals without accounting for the historical and cultural contexts that are foundational to how it manifests in both women of colour and white women. Imposter syndrome directs our view toward fixing women at work instead of fixing the places where women work. So what we have in the end is perhaps a pretty good example of a concept that seems easy to master at first and then turns out to have a lot more complexity to it the more we look. And perhaps the way forward that I'd like to offer you is just to hold the idea of imposter syndrome, if it interests you at all, with an open hand, being mindful of the ways that it can be useful to shine kind of a warm light on that tangle of private thoughts that we might have thought was our own little painful burden to carry, and then turns out to have much more of a universal experience to it, to be a pretty reasonably logical way of thinking even, and to have some potential to be beneficial, to actually help us in our studies and in our work. But at the same time, it's possible to be mindful of how it can be used to mask systemic problems in places of learning and in workplaces, and notice if there are patterns to the people that the syndrome gets associated with, and keep that really critical lens at the ready when it crops up in discussion, making sure that we're not being too focused on fixing individuals, whether that's ourselves or others, if what actually needs fixing are systems and places. As always, I'm going to finish up with a few links for you. If this is an area that connects with the way you're thinking about and planning your own career, I'd really recommend checking out the Job Shop, where there are lots of people and resources closely engaged with this kind of thing and very much at the ready to help you out. If there are points touched on that you'd like to discuss privately with a career consultant, I've given you a link so that you can make that booking. And if the ideas might be better for a counsellor, given how common these sorts of feelings are in university settings, our RMIT counsellors will be well placed to discuss these sorts of issues with you, and you have a link for that too. So thank you so much for listening. Wishing you all the very best with your studies and with your careers as always.
So yeah, thank you, Anna. So moving on and back to these confidence gremlins, Tupper and Ellis recommend identifying your own personal gremlins and working to cage them. So there's a bit about caging your gremlins. And what they recommend is finding ways to practice little things often that will help you build that confidence in that direction. So it might be if you're, if you lack confidence around public speaking, find ways of doing little bits of public speaking in one form or another. And so quite what the prescription is will depend on like the nature of the source of the lack of confidence, but trying to practice things a little bit and often is a key recommendation. The other key recommendation that they have is finding someone to talk it through with you. So I guess if you have someone, or if you can find someone in the fullness of time, and this might not be like in the now, this could be in the years to come, where you realize that you have a certain area where you need some confidence built, and you might want to find someone who you have some trust in and some respect for, and asking them about it, and you might find that they've found ways to cage that gremlin. However, for me, I think so. In terms of like caging the gremlin, that's not really that wouldn't be the approach, or at least the rhetoric that I would use. And in terms of these issues of confidence, or those parts about you that you either you might not be so fond of, or that you're working to improve, it's often referred to or talked about in terms of like fighting the anxiousness or the nerves and so on. But I don't really go in for sort of the caging or the fighting things, and I think a much better, for me at least, you do what you want. For me, the much better approach is, how do you care for your gremlins? How do you respond with kindness to yourself, right? So if you're the idea of like fighting a part of yourself is, on the one hand, it's kind of natural in terms of our social discourse. But I think, obviously you're just going to beat yourself up in a non-constructive way. So I think that I would be recommending thinking of ways of how to care for yourself and how do you care for your gremlins, because those things, those anxieties or those parts of you that are kind of worried about this or that, those are actually sort of parts of you that are trying to take care of you as well. So they're actually kind of trying to have your back, and in the same way you might be like, thanks, really appreciate this part of myself. I really appreciate the work that you're doing to try and bring this to my attention. This is a situation that you feel as if you might be exposed to some danger or something like that, or something might go wrong. But you're welcome to hang around. But I think I've got this, and I'll just carry on anyway. So I guess the question which I'll be asking, or recommending that you try and ask, is, how do I respond to my gremlin with kindness? And see what you come up with, and you can also ask, who do I trust that can help me with this? And these are the same questions as before, but I guess with a sort of a kinder, more caring, like rhetoric. So one thing to remember is that confidence is a skill, and you can build it. So skills are things that you can build upon, like learning piano, whatever the case may be. And confidence, if you think about it as a skill as well, then you'll realize that that is something you can work on and build towards, and you can, you can reap the benefits of that practice as well. So in terms of long-term strategies, in addition to finding ways to like continually care for your gremlins, other things that you can do or should be doing or consider doing, and we sort of talked about this before with respect to your CV, because we noted then that you may be doing stuff, but when it comes down to actually creating your CV, you'll forget kind of a lot of the things that you did. So we recommend you kind of keeping a consistent CV that you create. Or the other thing you can do is, like what I do, is make notes of those things as they happen. So you could write it down on paper, but the reality is you're going to lose that bit of paper or that book. So the more likely thing that you might want to consider doing, obviously you do whatever you want, is to install an app on your phone, one of these to-do list apps. I think is probably the best way to go. And this to-do list is just for things that you've achieved and are proud of. And what you want to do is make note of those things as you go along, things that you've done well. Recognize, reflect, and write down your achievements and successes, because you'll forget them, and in doing this you'll develop the practice of recognizing them, because we all kind of put our attention towards the things that go wrong, and that's kind of natural, but we want you to focus more on the things that you've done well, and this will be one thing that will help you to develop confidence over time. And another thing you might want to add is how you can help other people build their confidence, and so both finding opportunities for that, and then when it does occur, even in small ways, you might want to also make a habit of noting some of that down as well. And another area of attention that Helen Tupper and Sarah Ellis draw us to is about our social networks. So we've talked about networks before and networking, and I guess this is revisiting kind of similar points now, but I guess that networking was about how do we build our career. This is a sort of another form of networking in a way. It's about what other who are the people who inhabit your social universe that can help you in building your confidence and becoming more centered and more confident, and that sort of thing. So you might want to make a note of who are the people that whose help you can ask for or who you can turn to. And they also recommend making a list of the people who you do help or who you can help as well. And they also sort of have this solar system of confidence builders. And these might be people who, like you draw, to whom you can turn very regularly. People who you can turn to like less frequently, and less frequently again, and trying to map some of that space out. So there is, I guess, that mapping in terms of frequency of who exists in your network now, but not really. This is not just a conversation for like what is your network now, but in the months and weeks and years to come, how could you think about developing connections with people who you can draw on? And so this is both, I guess, a question for now, but probably even more like a longer term project. Longer term being like we're thinking in terms of years, right? And so therefore ensuring that you cultivate and reach out and foster and cherish those connections that you might build. So so think about your solar system of people around you. And then you might even want to think in terms of these categories that Sarah Ellis and Helen Tupper suggest, like the person who kind of understands you and where you're coming from. So there could be any kind of form of like general advice to people, but sometimes we need, if it doesn't really feel as if it jives with you, you might need to talk through things with someone who you feel understands you as a human being and how you operate and what your values are and that sort of thing. So there's the person who kind of gets you, then there's the person who asks the hard questions, which you will benefit from being asked. So these are sort of like critical friends, but not critical in the negative sense, but people who will ask questions that may be challenging, but aim to your benefit. And if you're kind of feeling like overwhelmed and not in that space, these might not be the person you go to in that emotional state. But when you're feeling more confident, ready to kind of start building again, then these are people you might be able to turn to get that frank and useful advice. And then there might be people who are maybe, they call Helen Tupper and Sarah Ellis call them the wise owls, but people who have been there and who have some experience in this domain. And these are people who may well be older than you or not, but people whose, I guess, experience and, I don't know, wisdom and whatever, however you want to think about it, that you respect and whose advice you'd like to hear and you may well benefit from, irrespective of whether you take it in the end or not. So that brings us to the end of the presentation about basically confidence and strategies to build it, both in the shorter term and the longer term. I hope it's been of interest. And I'll just leave you with a quote, which is at the back of Helen Tupper and Sarah Ellis's book by Matthew Cook, and he writes, and I think for me this is also a bit of like advice or perspective that I also would benefit from, and I think everyone would, can take something maybe away from you, see if it suits you. So you might not be the smartest person in the room, you might not be the most experienced, and you may not be the most talented, but you can always be the most enthusiastic. And I think that is something that we can definitely, tuck into our minds and bring to the next meeting. And if we're lacking confidence because we're not the most experienced or whatever, the enthusiasm is something that we definitely have control over. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, and we look forward to talking about some of this stuff in tutorials with you. Bye. Hi, just in case you're interested, where I'm filming this is so in there is what the hell's the building? Building 8. That's building 8, and then around here. So if you were able to go through that wall, that's the old Melbourne jail right through there. I don't know what building that is, and that is a little corridor down to. So that's Mr. Tulk Cafe, and sort of leading through to the State Library. That's a roped off door, and that's back to building 8, and a little not much used corridor somewhere there. Oh yeah, through there is Swanson Street down there. Okay, just in case you're curious. Bye.